If you look at a $1 bill today, you will see the words Federal Reserve Note. You will see the green ink and the stern face of George Washington. But what you are actually looking at is a piece of paper that holds a secret power over every human being on this planet. Most people believe that the US dollar is backed by the strength of the American economy, or perhaps by the gold still rumored to be in Fort Knox. They think it is the world reserve currency simply because America is powerful, but that is a lie. The real reason your money has value is not because of a gold vault. It is because of a secret deal made in the desert over 50 years ago. It is a deal that was signed in blood and oil. It effectively rigged the global financial system and forced every nation on earth to bow to the American central bank. This is the story of the petrodollar. It is the story of how the United States was facing total economic collapse, and how one man made a secret trip to Saudi Arabia to save the empire. To understand this heist, we have to go back to the early 1970s. The world was breaking. For decades after World War II, the global financial system was governed by the Bretton Woods Agreement. This meant that the US dollar was the only currency in the world backed by physical gold. If a country had dollars, they could walk into the US Treasury and exchange them for actual yellow metal. This made the dollar as good as gold. But by 1971, the system was rotting from the inside. The United States was spending billions on the Vietnam War and massive social programs. They were printing more money than they had gold to back it up. Other countries like France realized the scam. They started sending their dollars back to Washington and demanding their gold. The US gold reserves were hemorrhaging at an alarming rate. President Richard Nixon was trapped. On August 15, 1971, he went on national television and shocked the world. He announced that the United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold. Overnight, the dollar became a fiat currency. It was backed by nothing but a promise. The results were immediate and terrifying. Inflation exploded. The value of the dollar plummeted. The American economy was spiraling toward a Great Depression. If the dollar died, the American empire died with it. The government needed a new way to make the world want the dollar. They needed to tie the currency to something that every single person on Earth needed to survive. They needed something more important than gold. They found it in black gold, oil. In 1973, the world was hit by the first major oil shock. The Arab nations, led by King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, cut off oil exports to the West. The price of oil didn't just rise, it quadrupled. The global economy had a heart attack. In the United States, gas stations ran dry. People waited in lines for miles. The stock market crashed. The industrial machine of the West was grinding to a halt. It was in this moment of chaos that Henry Kissinger, the US Secretary of State, saw an opportunity. He realized that while the US had lost its gold, it could regain its power by controlling the black gold. He knew that Saudi Arabia was rich, but it was also fragile. It was a desert kingdom with a tiny army, surrounded by enemies in Iraq, Iran, and Israel. The House of Saud was terrified of being overthrown. In 1974, Kissinger and his team made a secret journey to Riyadh. They weren't there to negotiate a peace treaty. They were there to sign a business deal that would change the world forever. The terms were simple and brutal. The United States offered the House of Saud absolute military protection. We would sell them the best weapons on Earth. We would guarantee their security against any threat, foreign or domestic. We would ensure the royal family stayed on the throne forever. In exchange, the United States asked for two things. First, Saudi Arabia had to use its massive influence in OPEC to ensure that all oil everywhere in the world was sold exclusively in US dollars. Not German marks, not Japanese yen, not gold, only dollars. Second, the Saudis had to take their massive surplus of oil profits, billions of dollars they couldn't spend fast enough, and recycle them back into the United States. They would buy US Treasury bonds. Effectively, they were lending their oil money back to the US government to fund the American debt. It was a masterstroke of economic alchemy. Kissinger had successfully replaced gold with oil. This was the birth of the petrodollar system, and the implications were terrifying for everyone else. Think about the implications of this arrangement. Every country in the world needs oil to run its factories, its cars, and its military. Because oil was now sold exclusively in US dollars, every nation was forced to build up massive reserves of American currency. If Japan wanted to buy energy from Saudi Arabia, they first had to sell their Toyotas and Sonys to get dollars. This created a permanent, artificial demand for the greenback. It didn't matter how much money the Federal Reserve printed. As long as the world needed oil, the world needed dollars. This allowed the United States to run massive deficits and print trillions without causing hyperinflation at home. Effectively, the US was exporting its inflation to the rest of the world. Every time the Fed printed a new dollar, they were levying a hidden tax on every human being on Earth who needed fuel. But the deal did something even darker. It turned the currency into a weapon of war. It meant that the United States could sanction any country it didn't like by simply cutting them off from the dollar system. If a nation could not access dollars, they could not buy oil. If they could not buy oil, their economy would die. This gave Washington the power to decide which nations would thrive and which would starve. It was a silent, invisible form of colonization. The world was no longer under the rule of the British Empire or the Roman legions. It was under the rule of the Federal Reserve. While the American middle class enjoyed cheap goods and a booming stock market funded by cheap global debt, the developing world was crushed. Countries were forced to borrow dollars from the IMF and the World Bank just to keep the lights on. When the value of the dollar went up, their debts became unpayable, trapping them in a cycle of poverty that continues to this day. For 50 years, this secret system remained unchallenged. It was the invisible foundation of the American century. It funded the most powerful military in human history and allowed the US to consume far more than it produced. It was the ultimate free lunch. But secrets never stay secret forever, and every rigged system eventually faces a crisis. We are now entering a time where the petrodollar is under attack. The cracks in the foundation are visible to anyone willing to look past the headlines. To understand why the secret deal is falling apart, we have to look at the shifting tides of global power. For decades, the bargain held. The US provided the guns, and the Saudis provided the oil and the dollars. But the relationship between Washington and Riyadh has turned cold. The first major blow came from within the United States itself. The rise of fracking and domestic oil production meant that the US no longer relied on Saudi Arabia for its energy. America went from being the biggest customer of Saudi oil to being one of its biggest competitors. This changed the math of the secret deal. When the US didn't need Saudi oil, the royal family in Riyadh began to feel neglected. They watched as the US criticized their internal politics and made deals with their rivals. The House of Saud realized that the American umbrella of protection might not be permanent. So, they began to look for new friends. They began to look east, toward China. Today, China is the engine of the global economy and the biggest buyer of Saudi oil. For years, the Chinese were forced to use dollars to buy their energy, just like everyone else. But Beijing is no longer willing to play that game. For the last several years, there have been quiet and intense negotiations between China and Saudi Arabia about the one thing that was forbidden in the 1974 deal, selling oil in yuan. If Saudi Arabia starts accepting other currencies for oil, the petrodollar dies. The artificial demand for dollars will evaporate. If countries no longer need dollars to buy oil, they will have no reason to hoard US Treasury bonds. A flood of trillions of dollars would come rushing back to the United States, causing the kind of hyperinflation that the secret deal was designed to prevent. And it's not just China. The rise of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, signals a revolt against the dollar system. When the US froze Russia's dollar reserves after the invasion of Ukraine, it sent a shockwave through the world. Every nation realized that if they didn't follow Washington's orders, their national savings could be wiped out in a second. This weaponization of the currency has accelerated the process of de-dollarization. Central banks are buying gold at record levels, preparing for a world where the secret deal in the desert no longer protects them. If the petrodollar collapses, the American way of life changes overnight. The ability to run massive debts will vanish. The government will be forced to raise taxes or cut spending in a way that would cause total social chaos. The cost of everything we import, from electronics to clothes to food, will skyrocket because the dollar will lose its purchasing power. We have lived for 50 years in a bubble of artificial prosperity created by a secret agreement. Most Americans have no idea that their standard of living is tied to a deal made in a desert in 1974. They have no idea how fragile the system really is. We are seeing the Saudi royal family play a very dangerous game. They are moving closer to China and Russia. They are joining the BRICS organizations. They are signaling to the world that the age of American dominance is over. They know that the US cannot afford to lose them. If the Saudis walk away from the dollar, the music stops. The House of Saud is using this leverage to demand even more from Washington, while at the same time preparing to leave the dollar behind. It is the ultimate betrayal of the Kissinger plan. The student has learned from the master. The secret deal that saved the dollar also ruined the world in many ways. It fueled a century of endless war. It created a global economy based on debt rather than production. It allowed a small group of bankers and politicians to control the fate of nations. But the wheel is turning. The era of the petrodollar is in its twilight. Whether the collapse happens slowly or all at once, the result will be the same. The power that was centralized in Washington will be redistributed. The world will move back toward a multipolar system where no single currency can be used as a weapon. As you hold your money or check your bank account, remember that you are participating in a grand experiment. You are holding the paper remnants of a secret deal. The petrodollar was a bridge that allowed America to cross the 20th century without falling into the abyss. But the bridge is crumbling. The gold is gone, and soon the oil might be gone too. We are returning to a world where value must be earned and cannot be printed. The secret Saudi deal of 1974 was a masterpiece of diplomacy and a tragedy of economics. It gave us 50 years of kingly status, but it left us with a debt that can never be paid. The reckoning is coming, and the world that rises from the ashes of the dollar will look nothing like the one we know today. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.